A winter storm battered Boston on January 19, 1809, when a child was born who seemed destined to haunt the world. His name was Edgar Allan Poe. He entered life in a rented room above a theater, the son of two actors, one beautiful, one broken, already sliding toward ruin. Within 3 years, both would be dead. The boy who watched his mother waste away in an attic bed would spend the rest of his life chasing her ghost through verse and story. From the very beginning, sorrow was his inheritance. Every triumph he won was shadowed by devastation. Every love affair rehearsed its own funeral. And when his time came, Poe's death was as strange as anything he ever wrote, delirious, dressed in another man's clothes, whispering a name no one knew. This is not just the story of a writer. It is the story of how grief became art, how scandal became legend, and how a man who died in poverty gave the world genres that still define literature today. Elizabeth Arnold Poe possessed extraordinary beauty that filled theater seats and commanded audiences. Born in England in 1787, she inherited her mother's dramatic flair and musical voice, becoming one of America's most celebrated actresses. By 1809, at 22, she performed from Boston to Charleston in Shakespeare and contemporary melodramas. Critics praised her violet eyes, golden hair, natural grace, and emotional range. But theatrical fame came with a harsh price. Actresses lived on society's margins, admired but excluded from respectable drawing rooms. They traveled constantly, lived in boarding houses, and earned irregular income dependent on audience whims and theater management competence. Elizabeth's husband, David Poe Jr., abandoned the family in 1810, disappearing into the American wilderness. The son of a prominent Baltimore family, David had thrown away his legal studies and fortune to pursue acting, despite possessing neither talent nor temperament for it. Contemporary reviews described him as wooden and uncomfortable on stage. His marriage to Elizabeth had been his only successful performance. Left alone with 2 young children and pregnant with a third, Elizabeth continued working as her body grew heavy. The 1811 theatrical season found her in Richmond, Virginia, with the Placide and Green Company. Richmond society embraced the traveling players enthusiastically. Elizabeth's performances drew packed houses and glowing newspaper reviews. On a cold November evening in 1811, Elizabeth gave birth to her third child, Rosalie, in a modest room above a Richmond tavern. Edgar, now 2, and his older brother William Henry Leonard, 4, watched their mother's strength ebb daily. The difficult birth compromised Elizabeth's health, already weakened by years of poverty and professional strain. By December, tuberculosis had settled in Elizabeth's lungs. Unable to perform, the family lost their only income source. Word spread through Richmond's theater community that the beloved actress was destitute and dying. Charitable ladies organized benefits. Physicians offered free services, and the Richmond Enquirer published appeals for assistance. Elizabeth's final weeks unfolded like a staged tragedy. Confined to a sparse attic room on a straw bed, she lay with her 3 children clustered around her. Edgar, though barely past infancy, seemed to understand something momentous was happening. Contemporary accounts describe him as unusually quiet and watchful, his dark eyes following his mother's every movement. William Henry tried comforting baby Rosalie, while stealing anxious glances at their mother's pale face. Even as fever consumed her body and coughing fits racked her frame, Elizabeth sang lullabies in a voice that retained traces of its former beauty. She told her children stories from plays she'd performed, transforming their squalid surroundings into magical kingdoms where love conquered death. Fellow actors visited when possible, bringing what food and medicine they could afford. On December 8, 1811, Elizabeth Arnold Poe died at 24. Richmond newspapers eulogized her as a woman of remarkable talent whose life was tragically cut short, praising her devotion to her children and courage facing overwhelming adversity. 3 small children were left orphaned, their future as uncertain as dissipating smoke. Edgar Allan Poe, not yet 3, had lost both parents within his first 1,000 days. The trauma of watching his mother waste away would haunt him for life, manifesting in an adult obsession with beautiful women's deaths and pathological fear of abandonment. The boy who would write Lenore and Annabel Lee learned about loss before letters, experienced grief before joy. The children's dispersal began within hours of Elizabeth's death. Richmond's charitable community provided homes for the orphans, but keeping siblings together proved impossible. 3 different families claimed the children, severing bonds that might have provided comfort in shared loss. John Allan, a successful tobacco merchant, and his wife Frances arrived within days. They had attended Elizabeth's performances and been moved by reports of her circumstances. Frances, childless after several marriage years, was particularly drawn to Edgar. Perhaps she saw in his solemn demeanor and striking appearance an opportunity to fill her maternal void. John may have viewed taking the boy as charitable obligation befitting his rising social status. The Allans' decision proved both blessing and curse. They could provide material comfort far beyond anything his birth parents offered. John Allan's tobacco business was thriving, and the family enjoyed commercial success's social respect. But they never legally adopted Edgar, creating lifelong uncertainty about his household place and social standing. William Henry Leonard was sent north to Baltimore to live with paternal grandparents. David Poe Sr. and Elizabeth Cairns Poe had disapproved of their son's marriage and theatrical career, but accepted responsibility for raising their grandson. This separation from Edgar represented another profound disruption in the children's shattered world. Baby Rosalie found a home with William and Jane Scott Mackenzie, another childless Richmond couple. Like the Allans, the Mackenzies provided financial security and social respectability. Rosalie would grow up occasionally crossing paths with Edgar, but developing as a separate individual with her own family identity. Separating the children reflected early 19th century charity's practical realities, but ensured Edgar would grow up without siblings who shared his earliest memories. The boy who witnessed his mother's death alongside his brother and sister would process that trauma alone, creating internal narratives and emotional responses, shaping both personality and art. As 1812 dawned, Edgar began his new life in the Allan household on Tobacco Row. The transition from chaotic traveling theater to ordered merchant prosperity must have bewildered a child, not yet 3. Gone were irregular schedules, communal living, and constant presence of other actors' families. In their place came routines, expectations, and Richmond society's subtle hierarchies. Frances Allan embraced her guardian role with genuine affection. A gentle, pious woman with refined tastes, she provided desperately needed maternal warmth. She taught Edgar his letters, introduced him to books, and showed tenderness that helped heal wounds left by Elizabeth's death. In Frances, Edgar found not a birth mother replacement, but different love that would sustain him through future challenges. John Allan's feelings were more complex and problematic. A self-made man who built his fortune through discipline and shrewd business practices, Allan expected similar qualities from those around him. Edgar's sensitive temperament, early artistic inclination, and occasional willful behavior frustrated Allan's expectations of proper young gentleman behavior. Future conflict seeds were planted early, though they wouldn't germinate for years. Edgar's undefined legal household status, neither son nor servant, but something between, created ambiguities that would become painful as he matured. Allan's material comfort provision came with unspoken conditions and expectations that Edgar would increasingly resist as he grew older. But in 1812, these troubles remained hidden beneath what appeared to be rescue from poverty and abandonment. Edgar had survived his first great trauma, losing both parents before his 3rd birthday. He had found new guardians who could provide education, opportunity, and at least one source of genuine affection. Yet psychological foundations laid in those traumatic years would prove unshakable. The boy who watched beauty die in squalor would spend his adult life exploring relationships between love and loss, artistic achievement, and personal destruction. Edgar Allan Poe's true education began not in any classroom, but in that Richmond garret, where he learned that everything beautiful was fragile, that love and death were intimately connected, and that even the most talented could find themselves utterly alone when the curtain finally fell. John Allan commanded Richmond society with new money confidence. Born in Scotland and immigrated to Virginia as a young man, he had built his tobacco and general merchandise business into one of the state's most successful enterprises. By 1812, his firm Ellis and Allen occupied prime Main Street real estate, and his wealth allowed him to move in Virginia's highest social circles. Allen understood that in the antebellum South's rigid hierarchy, a man's worth was measured by fortune and visible acts of charity. Taking in the orphaned actor's son satisfied both his wife's maternal longings and his need to demonstrate elevated status. The Allen household on Tobacco Row reflected John's social pretensions. The three-story brick mansion featured elegant London-imported furnishings, a library with latest literature, and servants maintaining domestic order that impressed visitors. Francis Allen presided with gentle authority, ensuring every detail reflected the family's rising position. For Edgar, transitioning from theatrical boarding house chaos to this world of predictable routines and material abundance felt like entering a different universe. Francis Allen's love for Edgar was immediate and genuine. Childless, after nearly a decade of marriage, she poured frustrated maternal instincts into caring for the orphaned boy. She taught him to read using her childhood books, introduced him to Bible stories, forming her religious faith's foundation, and showed him kindnesses that make a house feel like home. Edgar responded with desperate gratitude of a child who had learned too young that love could disappear without warning. Francis became his emotional anchor in a world already proven capable of devastating cruelty. John Allen's feelings toward his ward were far more complicated and infinitely more damaging. Allen had agreed to take Edgar partly from genuine charitable impulse, but also because the gesture enhanced his reputation as a man of substance. He expected Edgar to demonstrate appropriate gratitude and develop practical skills and commercial instincts that made Allen successful. When Edgar showed early artistic sensitivity and intellectual curiosity rather than business acumen, Allen interpreted these traits as character flaws, needing correction. Psychological warfare between Edgar and John Allen began subtly, but would escalate into open hostility. Allen never legally adopted Edgar, keeping the boy in permanent uncertainty about his family, place, and future inheritance. This ambiguous status was reinforced by Allen's habit of introducing Edgar not as his son, but as his ward, emphasizing Edgar's dependence and outsider status within his own household. Edgar learned to read subtle signs of Allen's approval or disapproval, developing hypersensitivity to rejection that would characterize his adult relationships. In 1815, when Edgar was 6, John Allen's business interests expanded to include direct trade with England. The War of 1812's end opened new transatlantic commerce opportunities, and Allen saw chances to establish a London branch handling imports more efficiently than his Richmond operation. The decision to relocate temporarily to England would provide Edgar educational opportunities unavailable in America, but represented another major disruption in his young life. The voyage to England, aboard ship Lothair, in June 1815, was Edgar's first ocean travel experience. The 4-week Atlantic journey impressed upon him the world's vastness beyond Richmond and profound separation from everything familiar. For Francis, the trip represented adventure and opportunity to provide Edgar European education, distinguishing him from American peers. For John, it was business necessity, with the side benefit of exposing his ward to English society's cultural refinements. London, in 1815, was the world's largest city, exceeding 1 million inhabitants. The contrast with Richmond's modest 20,000 residents overwhelmed a 6-year-old boy accustomed to provincial Virginia's intimate scale. The Allen family settled at 47 Southampton Row in fashionable Bloomsbury district, surrounded by Georgian architecture and garden squares defining middle-class London life. Edgar's first impressions of the English capital would influence his aesthetic sensibilities for life, giving him taste for Gothic grandeur and atmospheric mystery that would later permeate his literary work. Edgar's formal education began at the Dubourg Sisters School in Chelsea, providing instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and proper deportment expected of young gentlemen. The transition from Francis Allen's gentle tutoring to structured English school environment challenged Edgar to develop new social skills and academic disciplines. His natural intelligence and language facility allowed him to excel in studies, but his sensitivity and American origins marked him as different from English classmates. In 1818, Edgar's education advanced significantly when enrolled at Manor House School in Stoke Newington under headmaster Reverend John Bransby. This institution, housed in an imposing Queen Anne building surrounded by extensive grounds, provided rigorous classical education centered on Latin, Greek, mathematics, history, and religious studies. The school's Gothic atmosphere, with ancient trees, ivy-covered walls, and strict routines, made profound impression on Edgar's developing imagination. Years later, he would immortalize Manor House School in his semi-autobiographical story, William Wilson, describing it as a place where reality seemed to blur with dream. Reverend Bransby proved a formidable educator, combining scholarly learning with rigid discipline. Under his direction, Edgar mastered Latin and French, developed mathematical skills, and absorbed classical literary traditions that would later inform his writing. The pedagogical approach emphasized memorization, recitation, and strict obedience to authority, developing Edgar's intellectual faculties while reinforcing his tendency toward perfectionism and sensitivity to criticism. The 5 years Edgar spent in England, from 1815 to 1820, were crucial for his intellectual and cultural development. He absorbed classical education's rhythms and structures, gaining familiarity with Latin and Greek literature that would distinguish his later work from many American contemporaries. More significantly, he experienced Gothic sensibility pervading English culture during the Romantic period. Ancient buildings, mist-shrouded landscapes, and sense of historical continuity, stretching back centuries, all contributed to the atmospheric imagination that would later characterize his fiction and poetry. During this period, John Allan's London business fortunes began declining. The post-war economic climate in Britain proved more challenging than anticipated, with increased competition and changing market conditions affecting his tobacco trade. By 1819, financial strain was becoming evident, creating household tensions even young Edgar could perceive. Allan's disappointment with business ventures may have contributed to his increasingly critical attitude toward Edgar, as if the boy's presence represented another costly obligation during economic pressure. Francis Allan's health also began deteriorating during the London years, adding another layer of concern to family circumstances. While the specific nature of her illness is not well documented, it was serious enough to cause worry and contribute to the family's eventual decision to return to America. For Edgar, who had formed such strong attachment to Frances as a maternal figure, her illness revived fears of loss and abandonment, stemming from his earliest traumatic experiences. The decision to return to America in 1820 was motivated by combining business failures and health concerns. John Allan hoped to rebuild his fortune in Richmond's familiar environment, where his connections and reputation might provide better opportunities than the increasingly difficult London market. For Edgar, now 11 and having spent nearly half his life in England, the prospect of another major transition was both exciting and unsettling. The boy who boarded ship Martha in summer 1820 was dramatically different from the 6-year-old who had left Richmond 5 years earlier. His English education gave him intellectual advantages few American boys possessed, including fluency in French and Latin, and familiarity with classical literature. His London experiences exposed him to a broader cultural world than he could have encountered in Virginia, developing his aesthetic sensibilities and understanding of social hierarchies and cultural differences. Most importantly, the English years reinforced Edgar's sense of being an outsider, a position both painful and creatively fertile. As an American boy in English schools, he had learned to navigate environments where he was marked as different by his accent, mannerisms, and cultural references. This experience of otherness, combined with his already complex sense of identity as an orphan raised by guardians rather than parents, contributed to themes of alienation and divided selfhood that would later characterize his literary work. The return voyage to America in 1820 marked the end of Edgar's childhood proper and beginning of his adolescence. The young man who disembarked in New York Harbor carried not only intellectual tools of classical education, but also psychological complexity that would fuel his artistic vision. His relationship with John Allan had survived the London years without open conflict, but seeds of future discord were already germinating in fundamental incompatibility between Allan's practical expectations and Edgar's developing artistic sensibilities. Francis Allan's continuing health problems cast a shadow over the family's return to Richmond, reminding Edgar that people he depended upon could disappear as suddenly as his birth parents had done. The lessons learned in England, both academic and psychological, would serve him well in challenges ahead, but they had also reinforced his sense of being perpetually between worlds, never fully belonging to any single place or identity. As the Allan family re-established themselves in Richmond society, Edgar began the delicate process of readjusting to American life while carrying within himself the cultural and intellectual experiences of his English years. The merchant prince's ward had become something more complex and potentially troublesome than John Allan had bargained for a young man whose horizons had been permanently expanded beyond the comfortable boundaries of provincial Virginia life. The University of Virginia, in 1826, was Thomas Jefferson's boldest educational experiment, a temple to learning built on the radical premise that young men could govern themselves without traditional authority. Jefferson's academical village, with elegant pavilions connected by covered walkways and centered around the magnificent rotunda, represented everything the Enlightenment believed education should be. For 17-year-old Edgar Allan Poe, arriving on February 14, 1826, this promised land of intellectual freedom would become the setting for his first great act of self-destruction. Edgar's academic credentials were impeccable. His English education had given him fluency in Latin, French, and classical literature, forming the foundation of gentleman's learning. Professor George Long, who taught ancient languages, later recalled Edgar as one of his most capable students, particularly gifted in Latin translation. Professor George Bladerman praised Edgar's facility with modern languages, noting his ability to move effortlessly between French, Italian, and Spanish. By all academic measures, Edgar was exactly the kind of student Jefferson had envisioned. The student body Edgar encountered reflected the wealth and privilege of the antebellum South. Most fellow students were sons of plantation owners and merchants who could afford substantial university costs. They brought habits and expectations of Virginia gentry: fine clothes, expensive horses, elaborate entertainments, and casual attitude toward debt that assumed family wealth would cover all obligations. The university's honor system created an atmosphere of apparent sophistication, masking deeper currents of recklessness and excess. Edgar took lodgings in room 13 on the West Range, a Spartan chamber barely large enough for a bed, desk, and washstand. The simplicity contrasted sharply with the elegant lifestyle many students maintained, reflecting John Allan's financial constraints on Edgar's university experience. Allan provided an allowance covering basic necessities, but left little room for social expenses considered essential for maintaining status among peers. This limitation, intended as a lesson in economy, instead became a source of profound anxiety and social embarrassment for Edgar. The social hierarchies proved more complex than Edgar anticipated. His connection to the Allan family provided some social standing, but his ambiguous legal status as a ward, rather than adopted son, created uncomfortable questions about his background and prospect. His English education sometimes marked him as different in ways not entirely positive. His accent retained traces of London years. His cultural references were sometimes foreign to Virginia-born classmates, and his serious scholarly approach set him apart in a culture valuing social graces over academic achievement. Edgar's response to these pressures was throwing himself into the gambling culture dominating student life after dark. Card games flourished in dormitory rooms and off-campus establishments, with students wagering amounts representing months or years of ordinary Americans' income. For Edgar, gambling offered a way to demonstrate he belonged among wealthy peers, that he could take financial risks with the same casual indifference they displayed. The mathematics of Edgar's situation were brutally simple. His classmates could afford losses because their families possessed resources to cover debts. Edgar had no such safety net. But gambling addiction's logic convinced him one significant win could solve all problems and establish financial independence. Instead, each loss created pressure to bet higher stakes, attempting to recover previous losses, creating a spiral leading inevitably toward disaster. By autumn 1826, Edgar's gambling debts reached alarming proportions. His letters to John Allan became increasingly desperate, alternating between appeals for understanding and demands for additional funds. Allan's responses grew more hostile with each request, reflecting his belief that Edgar was squandering opportunities Allan provided and demonstrating the irresponsible character Allan had always suspected. Edgar's academic performance remained strong despite mounting personal difficulties. His professors noted exceptional abilities and potential for scholarly achievement, apparently unaware of the financial crisis consuming his attention outside the classroom. This contrast between intellectual success and practical failures became a pattern recurring throughout his life. Before leaving Richmond for Charlottesville, Edgar had formed an attachment to Sarah Elmira Royster, the 15-year-old daughter of a respectable Richmond family. Their courtship was conducted largely in secret. Through clandestine meetings and passionate letters, Edgar wrote with all the intensity of first love. Sarah represented everything Edgar desired: beauty, innocence, social acceptance, and possibility of conventional happiness within Richmond society. During his university months, Edgar maintained correspondence with Sarah, pouring romantic longings and academic achievements into letters revealing both literary talent and emotional intensity. However, unbeknownst to Edgar, Sarah's father had begun intercepting these letters, concerned about the growing attachment and determined to prevent what he saw as an unsuitable match. Sarah, receiving no letters and interpreting Edgar's silence as indifference, gradually began distancing herself from their relationship. By December 1826, Edgar's situation had become untenable. His gambling debts exceeded $2,000, a staggering sum equivalent to several years of middle-class income. His creditors were becoming increasingly insistent about payment, and the honor code governing university life made defaulting on gambling debts a serious breach of gentlemanly conduct. John Allan's response to Edgar's final desperate plea for financial assistance was unequivocal refusal. Allan decided that paying Edgar's gambling debts would only encourage further irresponsible behavior, and that Edgar needed to face consequences of his actions. This decision effectively ended Edgar's university career and marked the point of no return in his relationship with Allan. Edgar's departure from the University of Virginia in December 1826 was abrupt and acrimonious. Unable to pay debts and unwilling to face social disgrace of remaining on campus as a defaulter, he packed his few belongings and returned to Richmond for what would prove a final confrontation with John Allan. The return to Richmond brought Edgar face to face with the full extent of his losses. Not only had he destroyed his relationship with John Allan, and ended his formal education. But he discovered that his romantic attachment to Sarah Elmira Royster had also been severed. Sarah, believing herself abandoned by Edgar, had accepted another suitor and was planning to marry a man who could provide security and stability. Edgar's circumstances no longer promised. The confrontation with John Allan was devastating for both men. Allan felt vindicated in his long-held suspicions about Edgar's character, while Edgar felt abandoned by the man who had raised him and possessed means to solve his problems with relative ease. Edgar's place in the Allan household was no longer secure, and his future would have to be determined by his own efforts rather than Allan's patronage. Edgar's first attempt to establish independence took the form of poetry. In March 1827, he arranged publication of his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, using funds borrowed from friends. The slim volume, published anonymously as work of a Bostonian, reflected both Edgar's literary ambitions and his sense of displacement from Virginia upbringing. The title poem told the story of a conqueror who sacrificed love for ambition, possibly reflecting Edgar's own sense of having lost Sarah through his pursuit of worldly success. The publication of Tamerlane represented Edgar's declaration of artistic independence, but highlighted practical difficulties in pursuing a literary career. The book received no reviews and attracted virtually no readers, disappearing almost immediately into the vast indifference of the American literary marketplace. Only 50 copies were printed, and today fewer than a dozen survive. For Edgar, the book's failure must have reinforced his sense that his talents were unrecognized. The months following his university departure were among the darkest of Edgar's young life. Without prospects for continuing education, without John Allan's financial support, and without romantic happiness he had hoped to find with Sarah Royster, he found himself at 18, facing an uncertain future, with few resources beyond his intelligence and literary gifts. The patterns defining his adult life were already emerging. Brilliant achievement, undermined by self-destructive behavior, romantic intensity, frustrated by practical obstacles, and artistic vision struggling against commercial indifference. The University of Virginia had been Edgar's first real opportunity to prove himself as an independent adult, and his failure there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The gambling debts that destroyed his university career represented his first serious attempt to claim a place among Virginia gentry, and his spectacular failure to sustain that claim. As 1827 progressed, Edgar faced a decision that would shape the next phase of his life. Unable to return to university, unwelcome in John Allan's household, and with no clear path toward financial independence, he would soon make a choice that seemed to offer escape from immediate difficulties, but would create new challenges and complications. The gentleman and gambler was about to become a soldier, trading one form of discipline for another in his continuing search for identity and belonging. The decision to enlist in the United States Army represented Edgar Allan Poe's first desperate gamble with his own identity. On May 26, 1827, he walked into a Boston recruiting station and signed his name as Edgar A. Perry, claiming to be 22 years old instead of his actual 18. The false name suggested something deeper, a desire to escape not just his circumstances, but himself. The young man who had failed spectacularly at the University of Virginia was attempting to disappear entirely, to become someone new who might succeed where Edgar Poe had failed. Fort Independence, perched on Castle Island in Boston Harbor, became Edgar's introduction to military discipline and communal living among men who had not enjoyed his educational advantages. Edgar's fellow soldiers were largely working-class men, seeking steady employment and military routine security. Many could barely read or write, making Edgar's classical education seem almost exotic in their company. Yet rather than feeling superior, Edgar discovered that military life offered something he had rarely experienced: acceptance based purely on competence, rather than social background or family connections. The physical demands of artillery training challenged Edgar in ways his previous life had not prepared him for. Handling heavy cannons, drilling in formation, and maintaining equipment required strength and endurance, contrasting sharply with his scholarly pursuits. Yet Edgar adapted remarkably well, perhaps finding in military discipline the structure his chaotic personal life had lacked. His intelligence and literacy quickly distinguished him among enlisted men, leading to his appointment as company clerk within months. Edgar's rapid promotion through non-commissioned ranks testified to his natural leadership abilities and organizational skills. From private to artificer to sergeant and finally sergeant major, he climbed the military hierarchy with the same facility he had shown in mastering Latin and French. By January 1, 1829, barely 20 months after enlistment, Edgar had achieved the highest rank available to enlisted men in artillery service. His superiors praised his reliability, attention to detail, and ability to manage administrative duties, keeping the battery functioning efficiently. Despite military success, Edgar never abandoned his literary ambitions. The structured routine of fort life left him time for reading and writing during off-duty hours. He continued refining his poetic technique and developing themes that would characterize his mature work. The dramatic setting of Fort Independence, with its ancient walls and commanding views of Boston Harbor, may have contributed to the atmospheric quality that would later distinguish his fiction. In November 1828, Edgar's regiment was transferred from Fort Independence to Fort Moultrie, on Sullivan's Island near Charleston, South Carolina. The relocation exposed Edgar to the distinctive culture and landscape of the Deep South, providing experiences that would later find expression in stories like The Gold Bug, Sullivan's Island, with its sandy beaches, palmetto trees, and subtropical climate, offered striking contrast to the harsh New England coast. By late 1828, Edgar had begun exploring options for early discharge from the Army. His strategy involved revealing his true identity and circumstances to commanding officers, explaining that he had enlisted under false pretenses due to personal difficulties. Lieutenant Howard, who had come to respect Edgar's abilities, proved sympathetic but made support conditional on Edgar's reconciliation with John Allan, requiring formal consent from his guardian before any discharge could be processed. This condition forced Edgar into the humiliating position of appealing to the man who had refused to pay his gambling debts and effectively driven him from home. In December 1828, Edgar wrote to Allan from Fort Moultrie, crafting a letter that balanced contrition with subtle reproach. He acknowledged past mistakes while emphasizing his current success as a soldier, hoping to demonstrate he had learned from failures and deserved another chance. The news of Frances Allan's critical illness reached Edgar in early 1829, creating urgent desire to see her before it was too late. He requested emergency leave from Fort Moultrie, but military bureaucracy moved slowly, and by the time his leave was approved and he reached Richmond, Frances Allan had already died and been buried. Arriving on February 28, 1829, one day after her funeral, Edgar faced not only the loss of his most reliable source of emotional support, but also the bitter irony that military service had prevented him from saying farewell to the woman who had loved him most consistently. Frances Allan's death removed the primary mediating influence between Edgar and John Allan, but it also seemed to soften Allan's attitude toward his former ward. Perhaps moved by shared grief or influenced by Frances's known affection for Edgar, Allan agreed to provide written consent necessary for Edgar's Army discharge. On April 15, 1829, Edgar Allan Poe received honorable discharge from the United States Army after serving nearly 2 years of his 5-year enlistment. His discharge papers noted his character as good and service as faithful, confirming he had successfully adapted to military life and performed duties with distinction. The transformation from failed university student to accomplished sergeant major represented significant personal achievement. Following discharge, Edgar spent several months in Baltimore living with relatives he had never known well, but who welcomed him as family. His Aunt Virginia Clemm provided a domestic environment, combining maternal warmth with practical support for his literary ambitions. Her daughter Virginia, then 7 years old, became like a younger sister to Edgar, creating family bonds that would prove crucial in years to come. Edgar's Baltimore time proved productive for literary development. He revised and expanded his poem collection, preparing a new volume for publication. In December 1829, the Baltimore firm of Hatch and Dunning released Al-Araf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems, Edgar's second published work. The collection included a revised version of Tamerlane, along with the ambitious cosmological poem Al-Araf, and several shorter lyrics demonstrating his growing technical mastery. While the book received little critical attention and generated minimal income, it represented an important step in artistic development. Even as he pursued his literary career, Edgar continued exploring military options that might provide more prestigious opportunities than enlisted service had offered. The United States Military Academy at West Point represented the pinnacle of American military education, offering training that could lead to a commission as an officer and respectable career in the peacetime army. With Allan's grudging support, Edgar obtained necessary recommendations and secured an appointment to the academy. Before entering West Point, Edgar experienced a significant change in his relationship with the Allan family. In October 1830, John Allan remarried, taking as his second wife Louisa Patterson, a woman considerably younger than himself from a prominent New York family. This marriage effectively ended any remaining possibility of Edgar inheriting Allan's estate or regaining a central place in his former guardian's life. On July 1, 1830, Edgar Allan Poe entered the United States Military Academy at West Point as a cadet. The academy, situated on a scenic bluff overlooking the Hudson River, provided the most rigorous military and academic training available in America. Initially, Edgar adapted well to cadet life, drawing on his previous military experience to excel in drills and discipline, while using his academic background to succeed in coursework. Edgar's growing disillusionment with his West Point career stemmed from multiple sources. Allan continued providing minimal financial support, making it difficult for Edgar to maintain the standard of living expected of a cadet. More fundamentally, Edgar began questioning whether a military career was compatible with his artistic ambitions and literary aspirations. The rigid discipline and practical focus of military life increasingly chafed against his creative impulses and desire for intellectual freedom. By early 1831, Edgar had made the calculated decision to seek dismissal from West Point through deliberate misconduct. Unable to afford the costs of honorable resignation, he chose a path of passive resistance that would force the academy to expel him. He accumulated demerits by neglecting duties, missing formations, and violating regulations in ways that demonstrated his intelligence even as they ensured his downfall. On January 28, 1831, Edgar faced court-martial on charges of gross neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. His guilty plea effectively guaranteed his dismissal from the academy, ending another promising phase of his education and military career. Edgar's expulsion from West Point on February 8, 1831, marked the end of his formal engagement with military life and closed off another conventional path to success and stability. The publication of Poems by Edgar A. Poe, 2nd edition, in April 1831, funded by his former West Point classmates, represented both an ending and a beginning. The collection included significant new works demonstrating his artistic growth, but it also marked his final break with conventional expectations and his full commitment to a literary career. At 22 years old, having exhausted his opportunities in education and military service, Edgar Allan Poe was about to embark on the most challenging and ultimately most rewarding phase of his life. His emergence as one of America's most distinctive and influential writers. Baltimore in the 1830s was a city of contradictions, much like the young man who arrived there in spring 1831, with little more than his discharge papers and literary ambitions. For Edgar Allan Poe, Expelled from West Point and permanently estranged from John Allan, Baltimore offered something he had never truly possessed: unconditional acceptance from blood relatives who valued his talents without demanding conformity to their expectations. The modest house on Wilkes Street, where Edgar took residence, belonged to his aunt Maria Clemm, a widow whose husband William had died in 1826, leaving her to support herself and her young daughter through sewing, taking in boarders, and occasional charity from relatives. Maria, then in her 40s, possessed practical strength and emotional warmth that Edgar had rarely encountered since Francis Allan's death. She welcomed her nephew not as a burden or disappointment, but as a beloved family member, whose literary gifts represented hope for the family's future prosperity. The Clemm household also included Virginia Eliza Clemm, Maria's daughter, who was 9 years old when Edgar arrived. Virginia was already showing signs of the beauty that would later captivate Edgar's romantic imagination: dark hair that caught light, like polished mahogany, violet eyes that seemed to hold depths beyond her years, and a delicate constitution that gave her an ethereal quality. More importantly, Virginia possessed a gentle, affectionate nature that responded warmly to Edgar's attention and instruction. Edgar's reunion with his older brother William Henry Leonard Poe proved far more troubling. William Henry, now 24, had been living in Baltimore for several years, attempting to establish himself as a writer, while battling health problems that may have included tuberculosis, and almost certainly included alcoholism. The brothers shared literary interests, and perhaps a genetic predisposition toward creative brilliance, but William Henry's life served as a cautionary tale about the dangers that awaited talented young men without adequate support or self-discipline. In October 1831, Edgar's worst fears about his brother's trajectory were realized when William Henry died at age 24. The immediate cause of death was recorded as consumption, but Edgar understood that alcoholism and general dissipation had weakened his brother's resistance to disease. The loss was devastating, not only as personal grief, but as a confrontation with his own mortality and the recognition that literary talent offered no protection against self-destruction. The Baltimore literary scene that Edgar entered in the early 1830s offered limited opportunities for professional writers, but it was more welcoming to experimental voices than the established cultural centers of Boston or New York. Edgar began submitting poems and stories to various publications, experiencing the familiar cycle of rejections, interspersed with occasional acceptances that barely provided compensation for the time and effort invested. The breakthrough that would launch Edgar's professional career came in 1833, when the Baltimore Saturday Visitor announced a literary contest offering prizes for the best prose story and the best poem. Edgar submitted multiple entries, including the poem The Colosseum and several stories collected under the title Tales of the Folio Club. The judges, including the established novelist John Pendleton Kennedy, were impressed by the quality and originality of Edgar's work. They awarded him the $50 prize for his story Miss Found in a Bottle, a tale of supernatural horror set at sea that demonstrated his ability to create atmosphere and maintain suspense through carefully controlled narrative techniques. More important than the monetary prize was the recognition Edgar received from John Pendleton Kennedy, who became both patron and mentor during this crucial period. Kennedy, an established author with connections throughout the literary world, recognized Edgar's potential and provided practical assistance that went far beyond casual encouragement. He invited Edgar to dinner at his Baltimore home, introduced him to influential editors and publishers, and eventually helped him secure his first steady employment as a literary professional. During this same period, Edgar's relationship with Virginia Clemm began to evolve from familial affection toward romantic attachment. Virginia, now 11 years old, was developing into a beautiful and intellectually curious young woman who responded eagerly to Edgar's instruction and attention. Their relationship developed gradually, with Edgar serving as teacher protector, and eventually suitor, in ways that reflected both the customs of the period and his own psychological needs for devotion and control. In 1834, Edgar's career received another significant boost when the Southern Literary Messenger, a new magazine based in Richmond, published his story Berenice. This tale of psychological obsession pushed the boundaries of acceptable literary content while demonstrating Edgar's ability to explore extreme mental states with clinical precision. The publication brought him to the attention of Thomas Willis White, the magazine's publisher, who began corresponding with him about the possibility of joining the magazine's staff. As 1835 approached, Edgar faced a critical decision about his future. The offer from the Southern Literary Messenger would require him to return to Richmond, the city where he had experienced both his greatest childhood happiness and his most devastating adolescent failures. The prospect of returning as a successful professional rather than a disgraced student appealed to his desire for vindication. Edgar's decision to accept White's offer was influenced not only by professional considerations, but also by his desire to provide security for the Clemm family. His growing attachment to Virginia made him increasingly aware of his responsibilities as the family's primary hope for economic advancement. On September 22, 1835, Edgar obtained a marriage license in Baltimore, listing Virginia's age as 21 rather than her actual 13 years. This deception reflected both legal necessities and social sensitivities. Edgar's departure from Baltimore in late September 1835 marked the end of a crucial period in his personal and professional development. The years he had spent with the Clemm family had provided him with the emotional stability and unconditional support he needed to develop his literary voice and establish his professional credentials. His success in the Baltimore Saturday Visitor contest had demonstrated his ability to compete with established writers, while his relationship with John Pendleton Kennedy had provided him with the social connections necessary for career advancement. More fundamentally, the Baltimore years had allowed Edgar to create the family bonds that would sustain him through the challenges ahead. In Maria Clemm, he had found a maternal figure who supported his ambitions without attempting to reshape his character. In Virginia, he had discovered a companion who could share his intellectual interests while providing the emotional devotion he craved. Together, they formed a domestic unit that was unconventional by contemporary standards, but perfectly suited to Edgar's psychological and practical needs. As Edgar prepared to return to Richmond and assume his new role at the Southern Literary Messenger, he carried with him both the literary achievement of his Baltimore years and the personal relationships that had made that achievement possible. The struggling young writer who had arrived in Baltimore with little more than his talent and determination was departing as a recognized literary professional with a clear vision of his future. Edgar Allan Poe's return to Richmond in September 1835 was a homecoming fraught with both triumph and trepidation. The city that had witnessed his humiliating departure from the University of Virginia 9 years earlier now welcomed him as assistant editor of the Southern Literary Messenger. Thomas Willis White, the magazine's publisher, had taken a considerable gamble on the 26-year-old writer, whose talent was matched only by his reputation for difficulty. The Southern Literary Messenger occupied modest offices on Main Street in Richmond's commercial district, but its ambitions extended far beyond its physical limitations. Edgar's arrival transformed the publication almost immediately, bringing a level of analytical rigor and literary sophistication that had been missing from American periodical literature. Edgar's responsibilities at the Messenger encompassed every aspect of magazine production, from soliciting contributions, to writing reviews, to managing correspondence with authors and subscribers. As a critic, Edgar quickly established a voice that was both distinctive and controversial. His reviews were characterized by an uncompromising commitment to literary excellence and a willingness to condemn mediocrity, regardless of an author's reputation or personal connections. Edgar's critical philosophy emphasized what he called the unity of effect, the principle that every element in a literary work should contribute to a single, predetermined emotional impact. This approach to criticism was revolutionary in American literature, where most reviewers contented themselves with plot summaries and vague expressions of approval or disapproval. The nickname Tomahawk Man that Edgar acquired during his tenure reflected both the sharpness of his critical blade and the fear he inspired among authors who might find themselves subjected to his analytical dissection. His review of Norman Leslie, a novel by Theodore Fay that had been praised by other critics, exemplified his uncompromising approach, demolishing the book's pretensions with surgical precision. Under Edgar's guidance, the magazine began attracting contributions from established writers who recognized its growing reputation for literary seriousness. The circulation increased dramatically, rising from fewer than 1,000 subscribers when Edgar arrived to over 3,500 within 18 months. The success of The Messenger provided Edgar with a platform for his own creative work. Morella, published in April 1835, explored the relationship between identity and memory through the story of a man whose wife seems to return from the dead in the person of their daughter. Berenice pushed the boundaries of acceptable literary content, while demonstrating his ability to probe the darkest corners of human psychology. Edgar's personal life during this period was complicated by his marriage to Virginia Clemm on May 16, 1836. The ceremony formalized a relationship that continued to raise eyebrows due to Virginia's youth and their blood relationship. Virginia was 13 years old at the time of the marriage, though the marriage certificate listed her age as 21. The marriage between Edgar and Virginia was characterized by unusual tenderness and devotion. Edgar treated his young wife with gentle consideration, recognizing both her youth and her delicate constitution. Virginia demonstrated remarkable maturity and intelligence, serving as Edgar's companion, inspiration, and emotional support. Maria Clemm, who had moved to Richmond with the newlyweds, continued to manage the domestic arrangements. Despite his professional success at The Messenger, Edgar's relationship with Thomas Willis White became increasingly strained as their different visions for the magazine clashed. White, primarily interested in commercial success, was sometimes uncomfortable with Edgar's uncompromising critical standards. Edgar, committed to literary excellence above all else, chafed under White's editorial restrictions. Reports suggest that Edgar's behavior became erratic during his final months at The Messenger, with instances of absence and apparent intoxication that concerned White and other staff members. Edgar's departure from the Southern Literary Messenger in January 1837 was officially presented as a mutual decision, but the circumstances suggest that White had concluded that Edgar's personal problems outweighed his professional contributions. The 16 months Edgar spent at the Southern Literary Messenger represented both the pinnacle of his editorial achievement and a preview of the professional difficulties that would plague his later career. His transformation of the magazine from a regional publication into a nationally respected literary journal demonstrated his editorial genius and his understanding of what American literature needed to reach international standards. Edgar's critical legacy from the Southern Literary Messenger period extended far beyond his individual reviews to his articulation of aesthetic principles that helped define American literary standards. His emphasis on technical craftsmanship, psychological credibility, and unity of effect established criteria for evaluating literature that elevated critical discussion above mere personal preference. Edgar's development of detective fiction during this period, beginning with The Murders in the Rue Morgue, represented another revolutionary contribution to world literature. His development of the ratiocinative tale, featuring the brilliant detective C. Auguste Dupin, established conventions that would define the genre for more than a century. The literary feuds that Edgar initiated during his critical career, particularly his ongoing conflict with the Boston literary establishment, reflected both his personal insecurities and his genuine commitment to challenging literary complacency. His attacks on what he perceived as the Mutual Admiration Society of New England writers were motivated partly by regional jealousy, but also by his recognition that American literature's independence required rejection of derivative literary traditions. The professional reputation Edgar established during his Southern literary messenger period would sustain him through the financial difficulties and career setbacks that followed his departure from Richmond. Publishers and editors throughout the country recognized his abilities as both critic and creative writer, even when they were reluctant to employ him due to concerns about his personal reliability. As Edgar prepared to leave Richmond for New York in early 1837, he carried with him both the professional achievement of his messenger years and the personal relationships that had sustained that achievement. His success as an editor and critic had established him as a major figure in American letters, while his marriage to Virginia and his bond with Maria Clemm had provided him with the emotional support necessary for creative work. The New York that Edgar Allan Poe encountered in February 1837 was a city transformed by ambition and commerce, its population swelling toward 300,000. The financial panic that had gripped the nation just as Edgar arrived made the city's contradictions stark. Magnificent mansions alongside squalid tenements, bustling markets coexisting with breadlines. For Edgar, arriving with Virginia and Maria Clemm, and possessing little more than his reputation as a brilliant but difficult editor, the city represented both unprecedented opportunity and devastating potential for failure. The publishing industry Edgar hoped would provide steady employment was reeling from the economic crisis. Magazines found themselves unable to pay contributors, while new publications struggled to find investors. Edgar's timing could hardly have been worse for a writer seeking to establish himself in America's most competitive literary marketplace. Edgar's literary productivity during this difficult period was remarkable. He completed several stories that would later be recognized as masterpieces, including Ligeia, a tale of a beautiful and intellectually gifted woman whose death cannot sever her connection to her devoted husband. The Fall of the House of Usher, perhaps Edgar's most famous short story, emerged from this period of personal and financial instability. The move to Philadelphia in 1838 reflected Edgar's recognition that New York's oversaturated literary market might be less welcoming than a smaller, but still significant publishing center. Edgar's association with Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, beginning in May 1839, provided him with the editorial platform he needed to rebuild his career, while offering him freedom to pursue creative work. The Murders in the Rue Morgue, published in Graham's Magazine in April 1841, represented Edgar's most revolutionary contribution to world literature. The creation of the modern detective story. The tale introduced C. Auguste Dupin, a brilliant amateur detective who solves crimes through logical analysis and careful observation of physical evidence. The detective story's emphasis on rational analysis established the intellectual framework for detective fiction that would later be developed by Arthur Conan Doyle and countless other writers. Edgar's personal life during the Philadelphia years was overshadowed by growing concerns about Virginia's health. In January 1842, while singing at the piano for guests, Virginia suffered a massive pulmonary hemorrhage that marked the beginning of her final illness. The hemorrhage was a symptom of tuberculosis, the same disease that had killed Edgar's mother. For Edgar, Virginia's illness represented not only the potential loss of his beloved wife, but also a traumatic repetition of his earliest experiences of abandonment and loss. Virginia's tuberculosis followed the typical pattern: periods of apparent recovery, alternating with increasingly severe relapses. Edgar's response combined devoted nursing care with increasing psychological instability as he struggled to cope with the prospect of losing the person who had become the center of his emotional life. The stress of Virginia's illness was compounded by Edgar's continuing financial difficulties and his growing reputation for erratic behavior that made it difficult to maintain steady employment. Contemporary accounts describe periods when they lacked money for food, fuel, and medical care, relying on charity from friends and neighbors to meet basic needs. The Raven, published in the New York Evening Mirror on January 29, 1845, represented both the pinnacle of Edgar's popular success and his most successful fusion of technical innovation with emotional power. The poem tells the story of a scholar who, while reading late one night, receives a visit from a raven that can speak only the word, nevermore. The poem's success was unprecedented in American literary history. It was reprinted in newspapers and magazines throughout the country, recited in parlors and at public gatherings, and memorized by readers who found its rhythm and imagery impossible to forget. Edgar became a literary celebrity almost overnight. However, the financial rewards were minimal due to weak copyright laws. Edgar earned only $15 from its initial publication. The success of The Raven led to increased opportunities, including the publication of Tales and The Raven and Other Poems by Wiley and Putnam. In 1845, these volumes brought his work to a wider audience, while establishing his reputation as a serious artist rather than merely a magazine contributor. Edgar's brief ownership of the Broadway Journal from October 1845 to January 1846 represented his final attempt to realize his dream of controlling his own publication. However, the magazine struggled financially from the beginning, lacking the subscriber base and advertising revenue necessary to sustain operations. The failure marked the end of Edgar's career as a magazine proprietor and editor. Virginia's death on January 30, 1847, at their cottage in Fordham, finally ended the long ordeal that had dominated Edgar's life for 5 years. She was 24 years old, the same age at which Edgar's mother had died of tuberculosis 35 years earlier. Her death devastated Edgar, who had nursed her through years of decline while maintaining hope for recovery, despite mounting evidence of its impossibility. The funeral was small and simple, attended only by Maria Clemm, a few neighbors, and Edgar himself. Virginia was buried in the graveyard of the Dutch Reformed Church in Fordham. Her grave, marked by a simple stone Edgar could barely afford. Edgar's response to Virginia's death combined genuine grief with psychological collapse that affected his ability to work, maintain relationships, and care for himself. Friends who visited found him gaunt and distracted, showing signs of physical and emotional deterioration. His literary productivity declined dramatically, reflecting both his emotional state and his practical inability to focus on the demanding work of composition. Edgar's literary work from the period immediately following Virginia's death reflected both his personal anguish and his attempt to transform that anguish into art. Ulalume, published later in 1847, presented a narrator who walks in a dreamlike state on the anniversary of his beloved's death, unconsciously returning to her tomb while trying to avoid confronting his loss. The years from 1842 to 1847 represented both Edgar's greatest popular triumph and his most devastating personal loss. The Raven had made him famous throughout America and established his reputation as one of the country's most distinctive literary voices. His detective stories had created an entirely new genre that would influence world literature for generations. However, these professional accomplishments were overshadowed by the gradual destruction of his domestic happiness through Virginia's illness and death. The woman who had been his wife, muse, and emotional anchor was gone, leaving Edgar alone with Maria Clemm in a world that suddenly seemed empty of purpose and meaning. As Edgar entered the final phase of his life, he carried with him both the recognition of his literary genius and the weight of personal loss that would color everything he experienced. The Raven's shadow that had brought him fame now seemed to darken his entire existence, transforming the bird's cry of nevermore from poetic device to personal prophecy. The months following Virginia's death in January 1847 found Edgar Allan Poe wandering through his Fordham cottage like a ghost haunting his own life. The rooms that had once echoed with Virginia's laughter and piano music now seemed to mock him with their silence. Maria Clemm, herself devastated by the loss, attempted to maintain some semblance of normal domestic routine, but both understood that their small family had been irreparably broken. Edgar's physical deterioration during the spring and summer of 1847 was alarming to the few friends who maintained contact with him. Always slight of build, he became gaunt and hollow-eyed, his clothes hanging loose on his diminished frame. Visitors found him alternately feverishly animated and profoundly despondent, his brilliant mind seeming to operate at the mercy of emotions he could no longer control. Yet even in the depths of grief, Edgar's creative genius continued to function, producing work that transformed personal anguish into universal art. Ulalume, written in autumn 1847, presented a narrator walking in a dreamlike state on the anniversary of his beloved's death, unconsciously drawn to her tomb despite his conscious efforts to avoid that sight of pain. The composition of Eureka during this period represented Edgar's most ambitious attempt to find meaning in a universe that seemed to have betrayed him. This prose poem presented nothing less than a theory of the cosmos that combined scientific speculation with philosophical reflection and poetic intuition. Edgar attempted to explain the origin and destiny of the universe through a vision of primordial unity that had been scattered into diversity and would eventually return to its original oneness. By early 1848, Edgar had begun to emerge from the initial shock of bereavement and to seek companionship that might help him rebuild some semblance of normal life. His first significant relationship after Virginia's death was with Nancy Richmond, known as Annie, a married woman from Lowell, Massachusetts, who became his closest confidant and emotional support. Their relationship, conducted primarily through passionate correspondence, provided Edgar with the maternal affection and intellectual companionship he desperately needed. Edgar's relationship with Sarah Helen Whitman represented a more complex and ultimately more destructive attempt to find romantic happiness after Virginia's death. Whitman, a widow and poet from Providence, Rhode Island, had initiated their correspondence by praising his literary work. Beautiful, intelligent, and sharing Edgar's interest in spiritualism and transcendental philosophy, she seemed to offer the possibility of intellectual partnership combined with romantic love. However, Whitman's family viewed Edgar with considerable suspicion and alarm. His reputation for instability and possible alcoholism created opposition to their relationship that would prove insurmountable. The crisis came to a head during Edgar's visit to Providence in November 1848. Edgar apparently interpreted some action by Whitman as rejection of his marriage proposal. In a state of desperate despair, he purchased a bottle of laudanum and consumed what he intended to be a fatal dose. Only the intervention of friends who found him in time saved his life. Despite the trauma of the laudanum incident, Edgar and Helen Whitman renewed their engagement in December 1848, with Whitman imposing strict conditions requiring his complete abstinence from alcohol. Edgar agreed to these conditions and briefly joined a temperance society. The engagement proved, tragically, short-lived. On December 23, 1848, the day before their planned wedding, Whitman received an anonymous letter claiming that Edgar had violated his temperance pledge. Whether the accusation was true or false, it provided Whitman with grounds to break their engagement immediately. During this same period of romantic turmoil, Edgar was simultaneously pursuing a relationship with Sarah Elmira Royster Shelton, his childhood sweetheart from Richmond who had recently been widowed. Their renewed correspondence had begun earlier in 1848, when Edgar learned of her husband's death. Elmira represented both nostalgia and practical opportunity for Edgar. As a wealthy widow with established social position in Richmond, she could provide him with financial security and social respectability. Edgar's literary productivity during this period of romantic chaos included some of his most personal and powerful work. The Bells, begun in 1848 and revised repeatedly, showcased his mastery of sound and rhythm to evoke different emotional states. Annabel Lee, completed in spring 1849, represented Edgar's final great poem and perhaps his most successful expression of love, transcending death. The ballad told the story of a narrator whose love for a beautiful young woman was so intense that it aroused the jealousy of angels who caused her death. Edgar's final attempts at establishing financial security through his own magazine project, The Stylus, continued during this period, though with decreasing hope of success. His reputation for personal unreliability made potential backers reluctant to risk their money on his venture. The magazine's continued non-existence left him dependent on the goodwill of editors and publishers, whose commercial priorities often conflicted with his artistic vision. The summer of 1849 brought Edgar what seemed like a final opportunity for happiness and stability. His engagement to Elmira Shelton had been accepted by Richmond society. His lectures on poetry had been well received, and he had even joined the Sons of Temperance in a gesture of commitment to sobriety. For a brief period, it appeared that Edgar might successfully reconstruct his life in the city where he had spent his youth. However, this period of apparent stability was undermined by Edgar's continuing psychological fragility and his inability to maintain consistent behavior over extended periods. His engagement to Elmira was conditional on his sobriety and good behavior, conditions that placed him under constant pressure to perform normalcy, rather than addressing the underlying psychological issues that created his instability. Edgar's departure from Richmond in late September 1849 was intended as a brief business trip to settle his affairs in New York and bring Virginia Clemm back to Richmond for his wedding to Elmira. His plans included stops in Philadelphia to collect payment for literary work, and in New York to arrange for the transfer of his household. The journey seemed routine, a necessary prelude to the new life he was planning to build with Elmira's support. The romantic complications of Edgar's final years revealed both his desperate need for love and companionship, and his psychological inability to sustain the relationships that might have provided them. His pursuit of multiple women simultaneously reflected not callous opportunism, but rather the panic of a man who understood that time was running out and who needed to secure emotional and financial support before his declining health made such arrangements impossible. As Edgar boarded the train that would take him away from Richmond for the last time, he carried with him both hope for the future he was planning with Elmira and the accumulated weight of the losses and failures that had marked his adult life. His final journey would determine whether the patterns that had defined his life could finally be broken, or whether they would claim him as their ultimate victim. The circumstances surrounding Edgar Allan Poe's final journey in September 1849 remain shrouded in mystery, creating a puzzle worthy of one of his own detective stories. On September 27th, he departed Richmond aboard a steamboat bound for Baltimore, carrying letters of introduction, a small amount of cash, and plans to continue to Philadelphia and New York before returning to Richmond for his wedding to Elmira Shelton. Contemporary accounts describe him as appearing somewhat unwell, but coherent and determined to complete his business arrangements. Edgar's activities during his first few days in Baltimore remain largely undocumented, creating a gap in the historical record that has fueled decades of speculation. He was scheduled to travel to Philadelphia on September 30th to collect payment for editing a volume of poetry, but no evidence exists that he ever departed Baltimore for that destination. The mystery deepened dramatically on October 3, 1849, when Edgar was discovered outside Ryan's Tavern, also known as Gunner's Hall, a building that served as both a tavern and a polling place during Baltimore elections. Joseph Walker, a compositor for the Baltimore Sun, who recognized Edgar despite his disheveled condition, found him sitting against a wall in a state of complete delirium. Edgar was wearing clothes that were clearly not his own: a cheap, ill-fitting suit, a palm leaf hat, and shoes that were too large for his feet. His own clothing had disappeared, along with his luggage and any money he might have carried. Edgar was transported to Washington College Hospital and admitted under the care of Dr. John J. Moran, a young physician who would later provide detailed accounts of Edgar's final days. Dr. Moran's initial examination revealed a patient in severe distress, alternating between periods of relative calm and episodes of violent delirium. Edgar's physical condition suggested both exhaustion and possible malnutrition, while his mental state indicated either severe illness or the effects of some toxic substance. During his more lucid moments, Edgar seemed to recognize his surroundings and could respond to simple questions, but he appeared to have no memory of how he had arrived at his current situation. The most puzzling aspect of Edgar's delirium was his repeated calling for someone named Reynolds, a name that meant nothing to Dr. Moran or to the hospital staff. Despite extensive research by later biographers and historians, the identity of Reynolds remains unknown. Edgar's physical symptoms during his hospitalization suggested multiple possible causes for his condition, none of which could be definitively established, given the medical knowledge and diagnostic tools available in 1849. His fever, tremors, and episodes of delirium were consistent with various conditions, ranging from infectious diseases to alcohol withdrawal to neurological disorders. Contemporary accounts of Edgar's behavior during his final days describe periods of apparent recovery, alternating with episodes of increasing distress and confusion. Edgar's final night was marked by increasing agitation and apparent hallucinations that may have reflected his literary preoccupations or memories from his troubled life. On the morning of October 7, 1849, Edgar's condition took a final turn for the worse. Edgar Allan Poe died at approximately 5 o'clock in the afternoon on October 7, 1849, 4 days after his discovery outside Ryan's Tavern. Dr. Moran reported that his final words were, "Lord, help my poor soul," though the reliability of this account has been questioned by some historians. The immediate cause of Edgar's death was recorded as congestion of the brain, a vague diagnosis that could encompass numerous actual conditions, from stroke to meningitis to various forms of poisoning. No autopsy was performed, and the medical records were subsequently lost, leaving the precise cause of Edgar's death as one of the enduring mysteries of American literary history. The funeral arrangements were handled by Edgar's cousin, Neilson Poe. The service was held on October 8th at Westminster Hall and Burying Ground, with only a handful of relatives and acquaintances in attendance. Edgar was buried in an unmarked grave in the Presbyterian section of Westminster Cemetery, his resting place identified only by a simple wooden marker that quickly deteriorated. It would be 26 years before public subscription raised funds for a proper monument. The mysterious circumstances of Edgar's final days immediately became the subject of intense speculation and debate. Various theories have been proposed to explain Edgar's condition and death, each supported by some evidence, but none proved conclusively. Alcoholism and its complications have been the most commonly cited explanation, though contemporary accounts suggest Edgar had been sober during his final weeks in Richmond. Infectious diseases, political violence, related to Baltimore's corrupt election practices, and various neurological conditions have also been suggested. Rufus Wilmot Griswold, Edgar's literary executor and longtime adversary, seized the opportunity presented by Edgar's death to shape his posthumous reputation through a character assassination that would influence public perception for generations. Writing under a pseudonym in the New York Tribune, Griswold published an obituary that portrayed Edgar as a friendless, envious, erratic man whose brilliant but disturbing work emerged from personal depravity rather than artistic vision. Griswold's attack on Edgar's character was motivated by personal animosity, professional jealousy, and genuine moral disapproval of Edgar's lifestyle and literary themes. The immediate impact was devastating to Edgar's reputation in America, where moral character was considered inseparable from artistic merit. However, Griswold's attack also generated a counter-narrative from Edgar's defenders, including Maria Clemm, Sarah Helen Whitman, and several literary friends who began the long process of rehabilitating his reputation. The death of Edgar Allan Poe at age 40 marked the end of one of the most turbulent and creative careers in American literary history. The circumstances of his death seemed to confirm the tragic trajectory that had characterized his adult life. Yet death also began the transformation of Edgar from a struggling writer into a literary legend, as the mystery surrounding his final days added another layer to the mythology that would eventually establish him as one of America's most enduring and influential authors. The man who had created some of literature's most memorable explorations of death and mystery had become the subject of his own unsolvable puzzle, leaving behind questions that continue to fascinate readers and scholars more than a century and a half after his death. The mystery of Baltimore had claimed Edgar Allan Poe, but it had also begun his transformation from mortal writer to immortal symbol of artistic genius. The immediate aftermath of Edgar Allan Poe's death seemed to confirm the worst predictions about his legacy. Rufus Griswold's venomous obituary had poisoned American literary opinion against him, while the mysterious circumstances of his death provided additional ammunition for those who viewed him as a cautionary tale about artistic genius corrupted by personal vice. In the months following his burial in an unmarked Baltimore grave, Edgar's works disappeared from bookstore shelves, and his literary innovations were dismissed as the fevered productions of a diseased mind. Yet even as Edgar's reputation crumbled in his homeland, his influence was beginning to spread across the Atlantic Ocean in ways that would eventually transform world literature. The key figure in this resurrection was Charles Baudelaire, the French poet and critic who discovered Edgar's work in the early 1850s and immediately recognized a kindred spirit whose artistic vision transcended national boundaries and cultural prejudices. Baudelaire's translations of Edgar's stories, beginning with their publication in French magazines in 1852, introduced European readers to a distinctly American voice that combined intellectual sophistication with emotional intensity. French critics, less concerned with the moral implications of Edgar's personal life and more attuned to aesthetic innovation, immediately recognized the significance of his contributions to world literature. The French enthusiasm for Edgar's work was particularly focused on his exploration of what Baudelaire called the mysterious relations between beauty and ugliness, between good and evil. This aesthetic philosophy aligned perfectly with the developing symbolist movement in French poetry, which valued suggestion over statement and emotional resonance over moral instruction. The impact of Baudelaire's championship extended far beyond France to influence the entire European literary landscape. German writers like E.T.A. Hoffmann and later Thomas Mann found in Edgar's psychological explorations new models for fiction that probed the dark corners of human consciousness. British writers from Algernon Charles Swinburne to Arthur Conan Doyle acknowledged Edgar's influence on their work, while Russian authors like Fyodor Dostoevsky incorporated his psychological insights into their novels of crime and spiritual crisis. The detective fiction that Edgar had invented with his 3 C. Auguste Dupin stories proved particularly influential in establishing new literary possibilities. Arthur Conan Doyle's creation of Sherlock Holmes was directly inspired by Edgar's analytical detective, while the entire genre of mystery fiction that flourished in the late 19th and early 20th centuries traced its origins to Edgar's innovations. Edgar's influence on horror literature was equally profound and lasting. His psychological approach to terror, which located fear within the human mind rather than in external supernatural forces, established the foundation for modern horror fiction. Writers like H.P. Lovecraft, who considered Edgar the supreme master of atmospheric horror, built upon his techniques, while acknowledging their debt to his innovations. The symbolist movement in poetry, which dominated European literature in the late 19th century, found its primary American ancestor in Edgar's verse. Poets like Stéphane Mallarmé and Paul Verlaine saw in Edgar's musical approach to poetry and his emphasis on emotional effect over logical argument a validation of their own aesthetic theories. The rehabilitation of Edgar's reputation in America began slowly and was initially driven by European recognition rather than domestic reevaluation. When French critics hailed Edgar as one of world literature's essential voices, American intellectuals began to reconsider their dismissal of a writer whose significance had been recognized internationally. Walt Whitman, initially hostile to Edgar's aristocratic aesthetic and psychological themes, eventually came to appreciate his technical mastery and his role in establishing American literature's independence from British models. The development of American literary criticism as a serious intellectual discipline owed much to Edgar's pioneering work as a reviewer and theorist. Edgar's impact on popular culture proved as significant as his influence on high literature. The detective story became one of the most commercially successful literary genres, spawning countless novels, short stories, films, and television programs that employed the conventions Edgar had established. His tales of horror became the foundation for an entire entertainment industry built around gothic themes and psychological terror. The transformation of Edgar from scandalous failure to literary saint was completed in the 20th century, as scholars began to understand the full extent of his innovations and their influence on world literature. The publication of reliable editions of his works, freed from Griswold's deliberate distortions, revealed the true scope of his achievement and the systematic nature of his aesthetic theories. Edgar's influence on science fiction demonstrated the prescient quality of his imagination. Stories like The Unparalleled Adventure of One Hans Pfaall and Melanta Tauta explored themes and techniques that would become central to modern science fiction, while his cosmic vision in Eureka anticipated aspects of 20th century cosmology. Writers like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells acknowledged Edgar's influence on their own speculative fiction. The development of modern literary theory found in Edgar's work a rich source of insights about the nature of literary creation and aesthetic response. His analysis of poetic composition in The Philosophy of Composition provided a model for understanding the calculated effects of literary art, while his exploration of the relationship between conscious craft and unconscious inspiration influenced theories of creativity that extend far beyond literature. Edgar's status as a cultural icon transcended his literary achievements to encompass broader themes of American experience and artistic aspiration. He became a symbol of the misunderstood artist whose genius was not recognized during his lifetime. The tortured soul whose personal suffering enabled extraordinary creative achievement, and the American writer who had to be discovered by Europeans before gaining recognition in his homeland. The institutions that commemorated Edgar's life and work reflected his gradual transformation from marginal figure to national treasure. The Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Richmond, the Poe House in Baltimore, and the Edgar Allan Poe National Historic Site in Philadelphia became pilgrimage destinations for readers. The Edgar Allan Poe Society of Baltimore, founded in 1923, became the center for scholarly research into his life and work. The creation of the Edgar Allan Poe Awards by the Mystery Writers of America in 1945 institutionalized his role as the founder of detective fiction. The annual presentation of the Edgar Awards became one of the most prestigious events in mystery publishing, while the award itself became a symbol of excellence in crime writing that traced its lineage directly to Edgar's three Dupin stories. Edgar's influence on popular music, from classical compositions inspired by his poems to rock songs that quoted his verses, demonstrated the continuing vitality of his artistic vision. Composers like Claude Debussy and Sergei Rachmaninoff set his poems to music, while popular musicians from Lou Reed to the Alan Parsons Project found in his work themes and imagery that resonated with contemporary audiences. Modern film and television adaptations of Edgar's works, from classic Hollywood horror films to contemporary psychological thrillers, continued to find new audiences for stories and themes he had pioneered. Directors like Roger Corman and writers like Stephen King helped ensure that his artistic vision remained relevant to contemporary popular culture. The ultimate measure of Edgar's achievement was not the recognition he received, but the creative possibilities he had opened for others. Every mystery writer who crafted a puzzle for readers to solve, every horror author who explored the darkness within the human psyche, every poet who valued musical effect over logical argument, and every critic who analyzed literary technique with scientific precision was building on foundations that Edgar had established. The scandalous and tragic life that had seemed like such a complete failure in 1849 had become, by the 20th century, the foundation for one of literature's most enduring legacies. Edgar Allan Poe had transformed personal anguish into universal art, private suffering into public treasure, and temporary defeat into permanent victory. Edgar Allan Poe died as he had lived, shrouded in mystery and controversy, his final days in Baltimore as enigmatic as any tale he had ever crafted. The circumstances that led to his discovery in strange clothing, delirious and calling for an unknown Reynolds, remain unsolved more than a century and a half later. Perhaps this is fitting for a man whose entire existence seemed scripted by the Gothic imagination he helped create. The scandals that once defined him have become footnotes to achievements that revolutionized world literature. The child bride who shocked Richmond society became the inspiration for some of poetry's most haunting expressions of love transcending death. The gambling debts that destroyed his university career taught him the psychology of obsession and self-destruction that would animate his greatest characters. The mysterious final journey that ended in a Baltimore hospital became the perfect Gothic conclusion to a life that had always balanced precariously between genius and madness. Poe's true revenge on his critics was immortality itself. The man, dismissed by many contemporaries as a dissolute failure, created literary forms that would outlive empires. The detective story emerged fully formed from his imagination, establishing conventions that writers still follow today. The modern horror tale, with its emphasis on psychological terror rather than supernatural spectacle, bears his permanent fingerprint. The prose poem, the analytical approach to literary criticism, the exploration of consciousness under extreme pressure, all flow from innovations he pioneered in magazines that paid him barely enough to survive. His influence echoes through literature in ways that would have astonished the struggling editor who could never keep a steady job. Baudelaire recognized him as a brother in artistic exile, translating his works and introducing him to a Europe that understood genius better than his native land. Dostoevsky found in his psychological explorations new possibilities for fiction that probed the criminal mind. Conan Doyle built the world's most famous detective on foundations Poe had laid with C. Auguste Dupin. From Hitchcock's films to Stephen King's novels, from the boardrooms where Edgar Awards are presented, to the classrooms where his stories still chill new generations of readers, his vision continues to shape how we understand the darkest corners of human experience. The transformation from scandalous failure to literary saint reveals something profound about the relationship between art and life, between private suffering and public achievement. Poe's personal tragedies, his orphaned childhood, his doomed marriage, his struggles with alcohol and depression, his desperate search for love and recognition became the raw material for works that speak to universal human experiences of loss, fear, and the search for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe. The cottage in Fordham, where he wrote, while Virginia slowly died, the Baltimore streets where he wandered in his final delirium, the unmarked grave where he lay for decades before public subscription provided a proper monument, all became pilgrimage sites for readers who understood that his suffering had not been meaningless if it could produce art of such enduring power. The scandals that once defined him dissolved into history, but the beauty he created from his pain achieved the immortality he had always craved. In the end, Edgar Allan Poe's most scandalous act was transforming personal tragedy into timeless art, proving that sometimes our greatest wounds become our most enduring gifts to the world. The orphaned boy who never found a secure place in society created a permanent place in the human imagination. The failed editor who couldn't support his family through his writing established genres that would enrich countless other writers. The man who died alone and forgotten became one of literature's most celebrated voices, his name as familiar today as it was obscure in his lifetime. The mystery of Edgar Allan Poe extends beyond the circumstances of his death to encompass the alchemy by which suffering becomes beauty, failure transforms into triumph, and a life that seemed marked by loss creates riches that will never be exhausted. His true monument is not the stone that marks his grave in Baltimore, but the continuing influence of his imagination on everyone who has ever been startled by an unexpected knock at the door, thrilled by a brilliant detective's deductions, or moved by poetry that captures the music of human longing and loss.